Today, we're going to discuss a paper that argues that the current artificial intelligence are unlikely to be conscious like us human, not simply because they lack the right functional organization, but because they compute in a fundamentally different way than the living brain does. Against the computational functionalism, which claims consciousness depends only on information processing patterns regardless of the physical substrate, the authors of this paper defend a form of biological computationalism, emphasizing that consciousness arises from the distinctive substrate-dependent computation of biological systems. The researchers here propose that the brain supports conscious processing through two essential features: scale, inseparable, multi-scale computation tightly coupled to metabolism, and hybrid computation that combines discrete operations with continuous or analog processing inherent to the biological systems, as discussed plenty in this channel. These properties are not incidental but central to how brain compute and adapts. Because digital AI systems lack these dynamical, structural, and material characteristics, the researchers here conclude that even highly capable models like LLMs or otherwise are unlikely to replicate the consciousness as it exists in the biological organism. So let's talk about it. Recent advances in artificial intelligence, especially when it comes to LLM models, have reignited an old and unresolved question, namely, can artificial systems ever be conscious like us humans? As machines become increasingly fluent in language, reasoning, and problem solving, it is tempting to assume that consciousness is simply a matter of sufficient computational complexity. This assumption is often rooted in computational functionalism, the view that consciousness depends only on the right patterns of information processing, regardless of the physical system implementing them. If the functional organization is correct, the argument goes consciousness should emerge whether the system is made of neurons, of silicons, or of something else. In this paper, rather than asking what functions an artificial system is missing, the researchers here ask a much deeper question. They ask whether biological and artificial systems compute in the same way at all. Their conclusion, for example, is that they actually do not, and that this difference is not superficial but fundamental to the emergence of consciousness experiences. The authors here position their argument between two dominant camps in consciousness debate. On one side is computational functionalism, which treats consciousness as substrate independent, but on the other hand is biological naturalism, which claims that consciousness is inseparable from the physical process of the living systems, while biological naturalism is often criticized for lacking a clear mechanistic account. The authors here argue that this gap exists because we have failed to properly characterize what biological computation actually is. A key contribution of this paper is that it claims that biological computation is not merely digital computation implemented in a wet hardware. Instead, it is a distinct mode of computation shaped by the constraints, the materials, and the organizational principles of the living system. Consciousness, then, in this view, arises not from abstract information processing alone, but from how biological systems compute as living, metabolizing entities. One of the central ideas introduced in this paper is the scale of inseparability. In digital systems, computations are typically modular and decomposable. Processes can be separated across level, such as software running independently of hardware, for example, or algorithms operating independently of the physical state of the physical machines, for example. But in biological systems, this separation breaks down because neural or cellular or metabolic and molecular processes are deeply intertwined with one another, where they influence each other continuously and bidirectionally. The scale of inseparability is not a design flaw, but an optimization strategy that is shaped by evolution. Living system, for example, must operate under strict energy constraint, maintain internal stability, and respond adaptively to unpredictable environments. As a result, biological computation is inherently multi-scale with no clear boundary between low-level physical processes and high-level cognitive functions. Conscious processing, then, according to the authors of this paper, emerges from this inseparable coupling across scales rather than from isolated computational model. The second major feature here emphasized in this paper is that hybrid nature of biological computation, where brains, for example, perform discrete computations such as action potential or synaptic transmission, where these discrete events are embedded within continuous analog processes. Electrical potential, for example, vary smoothly. Chemical gradients evolve over time, and neural tissues exist within a fluid dynamic substrate. These continuous dynamics are not incidental noise, but the integral part as to how information is processed and integrated within the biological systems. Digital computers, by contrast, rely on sharply defined state and symbolic manipulation. Even when they simulate continuous processes, they do so by approximation, by space, and by values, for example. These researchers argue that this distinction matters because biological consciousness depends on continuous valued processing that is physically instantiated, not merely simulated. The fluid analog nature of biological matter, for example, enables form of integration and modulation that digital systems cannot ever replicate in principle using purely symbolic computation. More importantly, the researchers here do not claim that artificial systems can never be conscious in any shape or form. Rather, they argue that the current artificial systems are built on a computational paradigm fundamentally misaligned with the one that gives rise to consciousness in biology, for example. Scaling up existing architectures, increasing parameter counts, or improving training data may enhance their performance, but these changes do not and will not address the underlying mismatch in computational mode. From this perspective, the absence of consciousness in artificial systems is not a temporary engineering gap, but a consequence of their current design foundations. Artificial systems lack metabolic coupling or the genuine hybrid computation rooted in physical dynamics. Without these features, the type of integrated, self-sustaining processing seen in living brains cannot and will not arise. This paper ultimately calls for a biological theory of computation that treats living systems on their own terms rather than focusing them into digital metaphors. Such a theory, for example, would recognize that computation in biology is inseparable from structure, from energy use or material properties, and ongoing self-maintenance. Consciousness in this framework of biology is not an abstract property that can be detached from its substrate, but a process that emerges from the unique way living systems compute while staying alive. This argument has significant implication as to how we think about artificial consciousness. It challenges the assumption that intelligence and consciousness are on the same developmental trajectory and that one will inevitably lead to the other. It also reframes the question as to how complex an artificial system must become to when and whether it begins to compute like a biological system at all. Rather than diminishing the achievement of artificial intelligence, this paper offers a clarifying distinction. Artificial systems can be powerful tools per se, capable of remarkable performance without sharing the computational foundation of conscious experience. Understanding this difference may not only sharpen debates about machine consciousness, but also deepen our understanding as to what makes biological minds fundamentally unique. In a sense, this paper is less about limiting the future of artificial intelligence and more about expanding our conceptual framework for consciousness. By grounding computation in biology, it invites a shift away from abstract functional equivalence toward a richer physical and grounded understanding of the mind. The frameworks aligned in this paper aligns closely with symbiotic intelligence discussed in this channel, especially the claim that intelligence and consciousness cannot be abstracted away from the physical and the biological system that generate them in the first place. If conscious information processing depends on scale inseparability, metabolic coupling, and hybrid analog digital computation, then the most promising path toward is not to replicate consciousness inside machines, but to design systems that remain coupled to living intelligence or biological intelligence, rather than treating biological information processes as noise to be filtered out. Symbiotic intelligence treats them as primary signals, recognizing that meaning, context, and intuition emerges from the continuous embodied dynamic of the living biological systems that can then be incorporated into the artificial systems. And from this perspective, artificial systems are best understood not as independent minds in waiting, but as cognitive patterns that extend and amplify biological computation without attempting to replace it. Symbiotic intelligence, in a sense, reframes the role of AI from an aspirational substitute of human consciousness to a complementary system that integrates with biological signals such as neural oscillation or physiological rhythms and embodied feedback loops. And in doing so, it directly addresses the computational gap identified in this paper, not by forcing artificial systems to become conscious, but by allowing them to participate in the same multi-scale biological grounded processes, information processes that give rise to conscious experience in the first place. Lastly, I want to mention that a couple of people have asked whether I hold private classes, and I'm actually considering it because this topic is getting more and more traction, especially with the next generation of AI coming up and or humanoids. And so if you're in that space and you're interested, keep an eye on it. I'll add more information in this description box below, because to be honest with you, whether we like it or not, biological system and artificial system will merge sooner or later. I have been doing this for the past 12 years, and that's why I publish my books. The areas in which I've been working on are to some extent quite extensive, and those who want to take these practical classes could potentially learn a lot more. Having said that, because this is an ever-evolving discipline, it's not going to be a course where it's like a practical course, like you go and learn, I don't know, plumbing. It's more about theoretical information mashed up with some practical sides of it. But then the other parts is more about giving you, as researcher or in the industry, if you are, ammunition, if you will, to continue your work, and also to then hopefully expand upon it and build upon it for future systems, which I've talked about this for the past 12 years. It's going to come whether we like it or not. It's already evolving. It's already happening. Most recently, I heard about a startup or two that were founded this year in 2025 that are kind of doing the same, but not exactly. So keep an eye on it. And also, of course, as always, I add the link to the research paper discussed below. Merry Christmas, everybody. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.